Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into one of the most powerful and, frankly, terrifyingly efficient energy pathways in the human body. Fatty acid oxidation. This is the mechanism we rely on to survive periods of fasting. But it's also a system so potent that if it runs even slightly out of control, well, it can lead to fatal conditions.
That's exactly the central theme of this deep dive. On one hand, you have fatty acid oxidation in the mitochondria, which is a massive generator yielding huge amounts of acetyl-CoA and ATP.
A huge amount.
But on the other, when this process is massively upregulated, say during starvation or, uncontrolled diabetes, the liver starts producing those acidic compounds we know as ketone bodies.
And those ketone bodies, acetoacetate, D3-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone, they're the biochemical tightrope we're walking. For you as a learner, understanding this balance is just. It's critical because the consequences of imbalance are so severe.
Precisely. If that fatty acid oxidation pathway goes into hyperdrive, those moderately strong acidic ketone bodies, they deplete the body's buffer reserves. And that causes ketoacidosis, which, especially in the context of uncontrolled type 1 diabetes, requires immediate intervention.
And the opposite failure is just as dramatic. If the pathway is blocked, maybe by a genetic deficiency in one of the enzymes, you get severe hypoglycemia.
Yeah, low blood sugar.
And why? Because the process of making new gluconeogenesis is absolutely dependent on the energy derived from burning those fatty acids. No fat burn, no sugar synthesis.
That really sets the stakes. We're essentially looking at the engine room of cellular energy metabolism and what happens when the fuel lines or the exhaust systems malfunction.
So let's start at the beginning. Getting the fuel to the engine. We need to move fat, which is notoriously hydrophobic, through the aqueous environment of the blood and into the cells.
And fatty acids are never truly free. The long-chain versions travel in the plasma bound tightly to albumin, which acts as a sort of chaperone.
Okay.
Once they cross the cell membrane, they immediately attach to a fatty acid-binding protein to keep them soluble and, manageable inside the cell.
That initial journey takes us to the first necessary energy investment, activation. I find this step a little counterintuitive. We're about to burn this fatty acid for a ton of energy, but first we have to spend energy to activate it.
You have to think of it as priming the pump. Before the fatty acid can undergo catabolism, it must be activated into an acyl-CoA molecule, often called an active fatty acid. And the enzyme acyl-CoA synthetase handles this.
And this activation is the only degradation step that requires ATP, but it's a costly toll booth, isn't it?
It is. It effectively costs 2 high-energy phosphate bonds. The reaction uses 1 ATP, but it cleaves it to AMP and PPI, or pyrophosphate.
Right.
And since that PPI is immediately hydrolyzed, it chemically guarantees the activation reaction goes forward, ensuring the process is irreversible, but demanding the energy equivalent of 2 ATPs.
So now we have our activated acyl-CoA, but we immediately hit a physical barrier, the inner mitochondrial membrane. The site of oxidation is inside, but the long-chain acyl-CoA can't pass.
Wait, if the body just invested 2 ATPs to activate it, why is it immediately stopped by a membrane? Doesn't that seem inefficient?
Well, that inefficiency is actually a brilliant regulatory design choice. That membrane barrier paired with the carnitine shuttle ensures that fatty acid degradation and synthesis, which happens out in cytosol, are physically separated and independently controllable.
So the carnitine shuttle is essentially the customs officer and the delivery truck all rolled into one.
Exactly. Carnitine, which is concentrated heavily in energy-intensive tissues like muscle, is the essential carrier molecule.
Okay.
The first key enzyme, carnitine palmitoyltransferase, or CPTI, sits on the outer membrane. This enzyme is the critical gatekeeper we'll talk about later. It strips the acyl group from CoA, attaching it to carnitine to form acyl-carnitine.
That acyl-carnitine then crosses the inner membrane using a special carry protein, the carnitine-acyl-carnitine translocase, which swaps the incoming acyl-carnitine for a free carnitine molecule being exported out.
And once it's safely inside the matrix, the acyl group is handed back to a new CoA molecule by CPT2. This frees up the carnitine for reuse and leaves us with a matrix-bound acyl-CoA ready for the main event, beta-oxidation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The core pathway itself, known as beta-oxidation. This cycle is just a masterclass in efficiency, cleaving carbon units 2 at a time.
We call it beta-oxidation because the enzymatic machinery specifically targets and breaks the bond between the alpha, that's carbon-2, and the beta, carbon-3, atoms. Every time the cycle runs, it shortens the fatty acid chain by 2 carbons.
And what are those 2 carbon units released as? The universal metabolic fuel,
Acetyl-CoA.
acetyl-CoA.
Take palmitate, for example, a common 16-carbon fatty acid. It will run through the cycle 7 times, yielding 8 acetyl-CoA molecules. And the fatty acid oxidase system does this through 4 essential reactions, which are basically the same pattern you see across many catabolic pathways.
Okay, so first we start with the dehydrogenation, which uses FAD and spits out an FADH2. Then we add water in a hydration step to prepare the molecule.
Then comes the second dehydrogenation, which this time uses NAD+ to yield an NADH. And the second dehydrogenase sets up the final step perfectly.
Which is the dramatic final cleavage, thiolysis.
Hmm?
The enzyme thiolase splits the now activated compound, releasing one molecule of acetyl-CoA and leaving behind a new acyl-CoA 2 carbons shorter, which immediately re-enters that 4-step cycle.
And the energy payoff is it's astonishing. We're not talking about the 30-something ATP you get from glucose. If we tally the complete oxidation of palmitate, so that's 7 cycles, we get 7 FADH2 and 7 NADH.
That alone translates to about 28 moles of ATP just from the reducing equivalents feeding the respiratory chain.
But then you have those 8 acetyl-CoA molecules. Each of those goes through the citric acid cycle, yielding roughly 10 ATP. That's another 80 moles of ATP.
So we form 108 total ATP. Then you subtract those 2 initial ATP equivalents we spent on activation. The net gain is 106 mole of ATP.
106.
That massive number is the crucial takeaway. It highlights why fat is our primary long-term energy storage molecule. It's just so dense with energy.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the body is prepared for more than just standard, 16-carbon fats. It has specialized pathways for unusual chains, and this tells you how often these non-standard fats actually appear in our diet.
Let's look at odd-chain fatty acids. Beta-oxidation works normally until you're left with a 3-carbon residue.
Yeah.
What happens to that little 3-carbon piece?
That piece is called propional-CoA. And through a multi-step sequence that actually requires vitamin B12, propional-CoA is converted into succinyl-CoA, which is a normal constituent of the citric acid cycle.
And the profound biological insight here is that this propional residue is the only part of a fatty acid that is glucogenic.
Right.
Meaning it's the only part that can contribute to the synthesis of new glucose. That's a really essential detail for a pre-health learner.
Then we have unsaturated fatty acids, which contain double bonds. The beta-oxidation enzymes, they're designed to work on the delta-2 trans configuration, but natural double bonds are usually cis and often in the wrong position.
So specialized enzymes have to come in. An isomerase enzyme corrects the position and geometry, flipping the bond into the delta-2 trans configuration so it fits.
Mm-hmm. And in more complicated cases, like when there are multiple double bonds, an additional reductase enzyme might be needed to eliminate or move the extra bond so the standard beta-oxidation pathway can proceed.
And we absolutely have to talk about the other side of oxidation.
Yeah.
Peroxisomal beta-oxidation. This pathway is fundamentally different, and it's mainly designed for very long-chain fatty acids, those C20 or C22 monsters that the mitochondria can't easily handle.
Yeah, that's a key distinction.
And I think the biggest distinction here is that it's not primarily about energy.
Exactly. This system's initial dehydrogenation step uses oxygen instead of FAD, which produces hydrogen peroxide, H2O2.
Wow.
That H2O2 is quickly neutralized by catalase, but the energy released isn't captured as ATP. It's essentially a detoxification and chain shortening pathway.
So it's a preparative step. The peroxisomal system shortens the chain to a more manageable size, usually stopping at octanoyl-CoA, which is C8, and then those shorter chains are transferred to the mitochondria for that massive energy payoff we just discussed.
And this peroxisomal system has another crucial role, shortening the side chain of cholesterol, which is necessary for the formation of bile acids. It's a key processing center for these massive lipids.
Now let's tackle the issue of what happens when the fat burn runs too fast. So what does this all mean when the liver has a massive influx of activated fatty acids?
Well, when conditions like deep starvation or untreated type 1 diabetes lead to an extremely high rate of fatty acid oxidation in the liver stops trying to fully burn all that acetyl-CoA. Instead, it starts packaging it up for export, a process called ketogenesis.
And the 2 main fuel packages are acetoacetate and D3-hydroxybutyrate. The third, acetone, is just formed via spontaneous decarboxylation of acetoacetate, and it's simply a volatile waste product that you breathe out. That's why people in ketoacidosis can sometimes have that fruity-smelling breath.
Exactly. The synthesis pathway occurs entirely in liver mitochondria. It starts with the simple condensation of 2 acetyl-CoA molecules to form acetyl-CoA-CoA.
Then, a third acetyl-CoA joins the party, catalyzed by HMG-CoA synthase, creating the intermediate 3-hydroxy-3-methylglutaryl-CoA, or HMG-CoA.
And finally, HMG-CoA alias cleaves that intermediate, releasing one molecule of acetyl-CoA and producing the primary ketone body, acetoacetate.
But what's truly unique about the liver here is the partition. It's the factory for ketone bodies, but it uses very little of them for its own fuel. It makes them to export.
Correct. They are crucial fuel for extrahepatic tissues like muscle, the kidney, and critically the brain, especially during periods of glucose scarcity.
I see.
In those receiving tissues, utilization begins when acetoacetate is activated back into acetoacetate-CoA by transferring a CoA group from cis-acyl-CoA.
And once that acetoacetate-CoA is reformed, Thiolase just splits it into two acetyl-CoA molecules, which then happily enter the citric acid cycle in the muscle or brain cell for full energy capture. It's a really elegant system for transferring massive energy across the body when glucose is unavailable.
This raises the most important question for regulation. How does the cell decide whether to fully burn the fat or to package it into ketones? There must be a finely tuned control mechanism.
The text highlights three crucial steps, and they form this beautiful chain of command. Let's start at the very top, the supply of raw material.
Step 1 is controlling FFA mobilization from adipose tissue. Ketosis just doesn't happen unless there's a flood of circulating free fatty acids. So regulating lipolysis, how much fat is released from storage, is the initial control point.
Step 2, and perhaps the most brilliant piece of metabolic engineering here, is that CBTI gateway we mentioned earlier. This enzyme controls whether the activated acyl-CoA enters mitochondria for burning or stays in the cytosol for esterification, packaging into storage fat or VLDL.
And the mechanism is what is so clever. CBTI is potently inhibited by malonyl-CoA, and malonyl-CoA is the very first intermediate produced during fatty acid synthesis.
Ah, so it's a built-in safety switch. When you're fed, you're synthesizing fat, so malonyl-CoA is high. And high malonyl-CoA blocks CBTI, ensuring you don't burn fat at the same time you're synthesizing it. No futile cycles.
Exactly. Conversely, in starvation, synthesis shuts down, malonyl-CoA levels plummet, the inhibition is released, and CBTI just opens the gate for maximum fatty acid oxidation. It's an essential switch that links the fed state to the fasting state.
And step 3 is the partition of acetyl-CoA inside the mitochondria. Once acetyl-CoA is produced, it has to choose between the citric acid tricle and ketogenesis.
Under conditions of high beta-oxidation, a mitochondrial traffic jam occurs. The concentration of oxaloacetate, or OAA, the molecule acetyl-CoA must combine with to start the citric acid cycle, it just falls.
So if OAA is low, the citric acid cycle stalls, and the incoming flood of acetyl-CoA has nowhere to go but into the alternative pathway.
And this OAA drop is caused either because the cell is using OAA to make glucose, that's gluconeogenesis, during the fasting state, or because the massive amount of NADH produced by beta-oxidation pushes the metabolic equilibrium away from OAA formation. This forced rerouting is the direct cause of ketone overproduction.
So when these systems fail, we see those two main clinical correlates. Let's look at failure leading to hypoglycemia first.
Any defect that impairs beta-oxidation leads to a crucial energy shortage. For example, carnitine deficiency means we can't transport the fuel in, leading to muscle weakness and severe hypoglycemia. Similarly, inherited deficiencies in the gatekeepers, CBTI or CPT2, impair the shuttle and result in non-ketotic hypoglycemia, meaning they have low blood sugar but no ketones because they can't burn fat to make them.
The same issue arises with inherited defects in the beta-oxidation enzymes themselves, like medium-chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency. These present as non-ketotic hypoglycemia and can lead to serious fatty liver, and they're sometimes misdiagnosed as SID's, sudden infant death syndrome.
And for a really shocking anecdote, look at Jamaican vomiting sickness. The toxin in unripe oaky fruit, hypoglycin, it specifically inhibits acyl-CoA dehydrogenases, blocking fat breakdown and causing acute severe hypoglycemia.
And on the flip side, we have the overwhelming excess that leads to ketoacidosis. While a mild state of ketosis is normal and helpful in prolonged starvation, when insulin is functionally absent, like in uncontrolled diabetes, the whole system just goes haywire.
In severe diabetic ketoacidosis, the release of fatty acids is maximal. CBTI is completely unregulated because of low malonyl-CoA, and the liver is desperately using all its OAA for gluconeogenesis.
A perfect storm.
It is. This perfect storm creates huge amounts of acidic ketone bodies, depleting the alkali reserve and rapidly pushing the body into a dangerous metabolic acidosis that is potentially fatal if not treated immediately.
We covered a lot of ground today, from the intense activation and the incredible 106 ATP yield of palmitate to the three crucial regulatory checkpoints: the FFA supply, the CPT malonyl-CoA gatekeeper, and the acyl-CoA partition controlled by OAA.
The main takeaway for you is the profound cause and effect relationship. Fatty acid oxidation is key to massive energy, but its dysregulation, either too little due to impaired transport or too much due to uncontrolled hormonal signals, has immediate severe clinical consequences, ranging from non-ketotic hypoglycemia to life-threatening ketoacidosis.
And a final provocative thought for you, the listener. The text tells us ketogenesis is a mechanism that allows the liver to oxidize increasing quantities of fatty acids within the constraints of a tightly coupled system of oxidative phosphorylation. Considering that the liver stops fully extracting the energy and exports an intermediate fuel instead, what might the specific evolutionary benefit be to sacrificing that extra ATP yield in the liver, purely for the benefit of exporting fuel to the brain and muscle? Something to mull over as you think about how we prioritize survival over local efficiency. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.